Hi, I'm Len Epp from Leanpub, and in this Leanpub podcast, I'll be interviewing Ved Sen. Ved is a consultant, author, and speaker who for 2 decades has worked at what he describes memorably as the interface of business and emerging technology. He's based in London and is currently a digital evangelist for Tata Consultancy Services, and in the past he has worked at startups and big companies. You can follow Ved on Twitter at Ved Sen, and you can read his professional blog at thefuture2go.wordpress.com and his really engaging personal blog at vedsen.wordpress.com. Ved is the author of a Leanpub book, Doing Digital, Connect, Quantify, Optimise. The book is intended to be a guide for people who are not technical but require better understanding of all things digital, particularly if their business or employer is undergoing some form of a digital transformation, whether it's in AI, data design, or software development generally. As it says on the book's landing page, anyone who works for a living needs to understand digital and its impact, which is a running theme in our interviews for this podcast, and I'm looking forward to talking to Ved about this subject. In this interview, we're going to talk about Ved's professional interests, his book, and at the end, we'll talk about his experience using Leanpub a little bit. So thank you for being on the Leanpub podcast.
Thanks very much, Len. Leanpub has been a pretty amazing platform, actually. I mean, we'll come back to that, I'm sure, later, but when I started writing this book, I thought, wouldn't it be great to be able to write it in an agile way and release version 1 and version 2, and that was before I came across Leanpub. So it was pretty amazing to hit Leanpub and realize that someone's actually thought of this and it's all available.
I usually like to start these interviews by asking people for what I call their origin story. And in your case, I know you've had a varied career across advertising and business journalism and lots of other things. But I saw from LinkedIn that you grew up in Kolkata in India, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what that was like, your early education and what it was like growing up there.
Sure. You're absolutely right that I did bounce around a lot, and probably took me a long time to discover what it was I wanted to be. But a big part of that was, I grew up in India, as you said, in the 80s and 70s, and that was kind of, it was definitely growing up in a poor country at the time. It wasn't that, I was particularly growing up in a poor family, but you were always exposed to poverty, and therefore the entire education system was always geared towards, just working really hard and putting all your effort into just doing well academically. All that kind of bypassed me, so I bounced around within the education system as well. But it was certainly all around me were the signs that, there was only one way out, and the difference between doing well and not doing well was very stark. And I think you'll find that across a lot of people of my generation coming out of a place like India. It's
interesting you say that. When I was reading, about your education history in LinkedIn, I saw that you went to IIM in Ahmedabad.
Yep.
And for those listening, this is a very prestigious institution. And it reminded me, I visited India for about 6 weeks in 1995, and I was, in my undergrad days at the time visiting with a friend from Patna, and all his friends were around the same age, naturally enough, and his cousins were too, and I still remember the intensity around, and in fact, some of the phrasing that they used to describe was similar to what you just used to describe the situation when you're young and planning your education. And I mean, I would meet people who were, were taking an entire year to study for a particular exam. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what that experience was like for you. I mean, did you take it that intensely?
Yes, in a way. By the time I got around to thinking about life seriously, studying management was pretty much the one thing that I really wanted to do. And when I look back, it's frightening how little we knew about life at that point of time, mm-hmm. And how what a loose grasp of reality you have when you're 20. But it was kind of the one North Star for me. And despite having a very spotty academic background and track record, I sort of really focused myself on getting through that very competitive entrance exam and then the group discussions and an interview process. So that was all very intense. I kind of think I got a wild card entry into the IIM Ahmedabad. But yeah, it was really something that when you start the process, you think it's just beyond your reach.
And what was the interview process like?
Gentle, actually, when I think back. But I think they wanted to probe. It was partly academic. They would because I had an undergraduate sort of degree in economics. They probed a lot of micro and macroeconomic questions, asked me a bunch of questions, and then they moved on to interests, and there were questions on value systems. I think that was the time. Um, I forget who it was, but one of the major sports people in the US was under a cloud for having done something terrible, and so we had a interesting back and forth about the rights and wrongs of that. So it was kind of a wide ranging interview, but there was certainly an academic part of it and a very non academic part of it as well.
And would you say the situation for young people has changed a lot since then, as they sort of, maybe with a loose grasp on reality, but look forward to their education and their careers nowadays in 2017?
Yeah, I think at the risk of sounding like a typical person in their late 40s, but I think that India post 1990 is kind of a different place. And go back to the initial point I made. I don't think kids growing up, especially in the cities, I don't think people growing up in India today feel that they are growing up in a poor country. I think the aspiration levels are incredibly high. The options are different and better. And I don't think you're straitjacketed into, three and a half professions. You're either an engineer or a doctor or a lawyer, or perhaps, you go to the IIMs, and that's pretty much it for career options. And I think that world has changed. Today, people aspire for a very wide range of things, and people fresh out of college get into entrepreneurship, start their own businesses. All of that was kind of certainly beyond our reach, both from an aspirations perspective and also from just the reality of how you would go about doing something like that.
Yeah, I remember the concept of opening up was something that was being talked about when I was there in 1995. There was, I think, an economic opening that had happened just I guess probably starting in 1990, as you suggest, where new products were available that weren't available before, and ideas about loosening restrictions around getting money out and getting money in to the country were things that people talked about a lot. I remember actually even being at the official launch of Windows 95 in Delhi. And yeah, you could play video in your web browser, which was quite the thing. There was this real sense of opening up and a very strong self-awareness and national pride about it as well.
That's true, actually. I mean, I think the India that you see today in the 90s and beyond, that's one of the strong characteristics I associate with it, that there is a sense of pride. When I was growing up, anything that was made abroad had the shine, and anything that was made in India was kind of seen as inferior. And I think that's changed. I think people now are proud about things that are made in India, and I think that all goes back to that cultural, economic, and social, change that has taken place since that liberalization point of the early 90s.
And how has Kolkata changed since you were there?
Kolkata is a city that resists. Yeah, it's a city that resists time, and Kolkata changes less than most of the other places, and that's good and bad. I mean, it's good because it has a certain timelessness to it, and you can go back today to Kolkata and see a lot of things that haven't really changed at all, even visually from when I was 10, 12 years old. And that's very comforting in a way, but also I think economically it has stagnated. I mean, in the 70s and even after the 80s, Kolkata was a very vibrant city. It was one of the economic centers of India. It's gotten a lot more marginalized now. And so barring a few specific companies and professions, most people growing up in Kolkata now head out for work. So it's a great place to visit, but I'm not sure if it's a hotbed for as a professional option anymore.
My last, I think, India-related question is one of the things that people who follow, tech and things like that would be aware of in India is the identification process for individuals that's been going on with biometric identification. And as I gather, one of the very important reasons for this is that there's a lot of not a lot. I shouldn't load it that way. The government provides assistance to people in India, as governments do everywhere, but often that link between the government issuing the money and that money getting to the individual it's intended for can be severed or compromised. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you know about that process. I think hundreds of millions of people have been registered.
That's true. So maybe I should preamble that, first of all, this is only my opinion, and also that I think I'm probably not an expert on this. I certainly have lots of friends who are much closer and much more are tracking this much more closely. But I think as a fundamental sort of data infrastructure, if you will, in a digital world, I think this is a fairly forward-thinking move. I know that across the world, in especially in the West, there's a lot of concern about tracking identities or going down the path of identity cards. And there is always going to be a kind of political question mark around it, because that kind of data, that kind of power in the hands of the wrong government or the wrong regime can obviously lead to a lot of unfortunate outcomes. But at the same time, a lot of good can come out of being able to actually track and deliver benefits to individuals. And I think, as with every technology, it has a power to do good and the opportunity to be exploited. But if I was to take a positive spin and being generally an optimist, I would think that this is something that in the years to come, people will look back and think of as a really important milestone in the developmental story. I think as you said, about 600 million people or thereabouts have been, put into the ID system. Obviously, there will be lots of issues around how it's implemented, and there'll be some at those kinds of numbers. There's always some implementation challenges, but I think the sheer scale of the project, the aspirational audacity of it, and so far the execution of it, I think, has been fairly impressive.
Yeah, thanks for that description of the issues involved. That's very good. I've got to say, I myself am an optimist when it comes to this kind of thing. When you watch political controversies around, say, voter identification in the United States, it seems to me that the trade-off optimistically, sort of is worth it in so many different ways. When it comes to issues around identification and the empowerment, actually, that proper identification gives you. So back to you. You at one time, how did you make your way to business journalism? I'm curious about that.
That was just a combination, of the fact that I'd come out of business school just a year or so before that. I always had a yen for writing. And when I met with the then editor of Business Today, if you look back at that period and if you look at Business Today magazine in that mid-1990s, you'll see that they were modeling themselves around being an Indian HBR, if you will. There was a lot of focus on management writing and the latest thinking and trying to sort of build a body of knowledge around management. So I guess my profile suited that well. And I was able to use my, business background and do a lot of interesting work around creating new models, which would find themselves into journalistic output. So it ticked both boxes for me.
Can you maybe talk a little bit about one of your favorite stories or subjects from around that time?
Sure. I think if I look back, some of them are still valid, some of them have gotten very dated, but I remember the piece that I spent a lot of time doing was around the idea of time-based competition and just sort of using time as an important competitive parameter and then breaking it down into, strategic project cycle and individual time management and sort of looking at examples of strategic speed. There were some very famous examples in the 1980s between Japanese motorcycle manufacturers who started churning out, I think, over 100 models a year in this model of time-based competition. Honda was certainly one of them. I think the other one was Kawasaki, but I'm not sure. But that kind of using time fundamentally as a competitive parameter and just being faster than your competition across whether it was a strategic maneuver or a cycle time improvement. And interestingly enough, that's sort of come all the way around, and that's what we talk about today a lot in terms of the clock of a Silicon Valley startup versus the clock of a clock speed of a large corporate. So that theme I think has survived, but I do remember I spent a lot of time exploring that model and trying to understand how best at that time what companies were doing in order to be able to compete on time.
That's really interesting about analogy to clock speed. It just sparked in me the idea that clocks tick more slowly the closer you get to a source of gravity.
Yes.
And that being near a big business might slow down your clock, as opposed to being a small startup.
That's very true. I mean, I didn't think of it relativistically, but I'm sure that can be explored into quite an interesting piece as well.
I saw also that you at one point worked for MTV.
That's true. In the sense that I was at the time doing my own consulting work. I'd set up as essentially as a consulting firm, and I was doing both consulting work and trying to use my spare time to dig around a couple of areas where I could think about doing a startup. And during that period, which was sort of between 2007 and 2010, the bulk of my consulting was with MTV. So I did do a number of projects for them, and they were at the time in the throes of moving from a tape and analog based world to a digital world. So we did a lot of work around movement of media and moving to digital models, not just externally, but within their internal operations as well.
Yeah, it seems like exactly the place to be for someone with the interest and expertise that you have. I mean, this intersection of television, pop culture, and music to the extent that they still do that. What do you think the challenges are for media companies like that, going forward now? They're the biggest challenges, I should say. There are always challenges.
I think it's, I'd be preaching to the converted if we sort of started touting or listing all the problems that media companies have had. But I think, the biggest challenge, of course, is that the revenue model is broken for traditional media companies. And so one of the big challenges that all media companies have had to deal with is the erosion of advertising revenue. And that all sort of 90% of media historically use this very interruptive model. And it's something that consumers, media companies, and advertisers sort of dance to, while everybody knows that that's pretty much when people sort of either turn off their sound or go make a cup of tea. And that's been sort of an open secret, but it's sort of sustained the industry for a long while. But I think now that people have come up with alternative models, be it over-the-top television, or other forms of advertising, and the fact that brands can directly reach consumers with their own messages and they're not reliant on big media for reaching large audiences, all of that has completely broken the back of what has been the gravy train, I should say, for large media organizations. So I think that's at the core of their challenges. But equally, I think there's another very interesting proposition, which I think came out of a couple of people. I think there were Mohanbir Sawhney and a colleague of his who wrote a piece that came out in the HBR a while ago. And I really like that model, which is basically about the fact that in any network, value resides at the edges or the core. And so if you look at media businesses or the media industry as a network, that kind of translates to you either own the customer, which is at the edge, or you own the content, which is the core. And if you're a traditional television channel, which is the bit in the middle, where you neither own the content nor the end customer, that's where you're sort of in the crosshairs for disruption, because all the money will flow and the value and the money will flow to those two ends. It's the people who own the content and the people who own the customers, which in the case of broadcast media is the platform owner. And I think that's the model you're seeing today, that it's the Netflixes and the HBOs who create original content. And in the case of people like Netflix, who also own the customer and have the billing and commercial relationship, that's where the value is. And all your traditional television channels who are really sort of in the old world deriving value by connecting content to people, they have all been disrupted.
It's really interesting when you talk about owning the content in Netflix. And I should mention, by the way, that when we talk about HBR, we're talking about the Harvard Business Review.
Sorry, I should have clarified. Yes,
that's totally fine. This is a jargon-filled podcast. That's okay. We have lots of technical people. But yeah, I find the production of content and the changes that, I mean, just, as an outsider watching, the media around it for the last few years is just fascinating. I mean, when I think about, the model I grew up with where they manipulated the sound to make it louder during the commercial.
Of course.
And sort of, the I hesitate to call it creative, but the sort of creative impulse behind how can I assault the ears of people in their own homes in order to sell stuff. The switch from that to I've got to compete to make the best quality content in order to succeed is really dramatic. And is that, do you think is that a Pollyanna-ish understanding of the shift that's happening? Or is that really what's going on? Have we really moved on to a world where you make more money by just making better shows?
I think there's certainly a big chunk of that. And I think that will lead us to a point where we will really question the number of media channels and outlets that we need. Because in the advertising model, it allowed the proliferation of a number of, channels, and we didn't really have to worry about them because somebody else was paying for it. But if you had to pay for all the content you consume, you'd be a lot more specific, and I would be a lot more specific about which bits I really wanted to fund. And I think that would see a great narrowing of media and of media channels. And a part of me thinks that's quite healthy. Because, they always say if you're not paying for it, then you are the product. And that's very true of the advertising-driven model. Again, taking a cynical view, that has led to a lot of challenges. A lot of the stuff around clickbait pretty much stems from that need to derive advertising revenues. So I think in some ways the direct relationship between a media producer and a paying reader or viewer is a much healthier one. But I don't want to suggest that, we should just sort of all jump to a completely different extreme. I'm sure there's place for sponsorship, advertising, and other creative models. But I think it's just moving, to one extreme where we've been for the last many years and arriving at somewhere that's a lot more healthier, maybe a midpoint, rather than try and sort of move completely to the other end of the spectrum.
Yeah, it's interesting. That makes me think of the discussion people have nowadays about silos, and I hadn't quite gone down that path in thinking that moving to subscription-based models where you pay and then become more selective, that could possibly have an impact on that siloing that we might be seeing happening in our societies.
Absolutely, and that would lead you to an interesting question about entertainment content versus news content, because news content has a value beyond the individual. There is a societal value in consuming news, and perhaps we need to be thinking about having different models for news and entertainment, which we don't today. We kind of mix them up, and maybe one cross subsidizes the other. But the fact that there is a societal value and there is a value to news you should be seeing and watching versus that you would rather be watching if you had a choice. There is that kind of trade-off there as well, right? So maybe there's a need to think about news and entertainment as two slightly different products that probably need to be funded differently.
Speaking of news and perhaps on a level entertainment, you have a recent blog post where you talk about how things seem very unpredictable in the world right now. And as someone who works in the technology space in the UK, I wanted to ask you a little bit about Brexit. I just wanted to mention that I lived in the country for about 9 years myself. And for the last couple of years I was there, I was, working in the city on a, work visa. And so I feel a little bit of a connection when I hear about things like thousands of investment banking jobs leaving London and going over to the continent and elsewhere. And as someone on the ground, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what the sense is in London right now for people, working in various sectors of technology and banking and things like that, about what's going to happen going forward.
I think it's fair to say that there's a general air of uncertainty, and nobody quite knows what will happen, because while there is the looming specter of a Brexit and its fallout, there are so many pieces of that are kind of dependent on how the negotiations go between the UK and the to-be-elected new government, because we have a general election coming up. And, the ramifications that are just not known at this point of time. So a lot might depend on the specific outcomes of the negotiations. But I think that leads to the point that most large organizations are having to sort of hedge their options at this point of time. Certainly, there are scenarios under which a lot of firms that are European by headquarter or by their sort of profile may have to think very hard about what operations to keep in London and which ones they would rather move to another major European capital. And the unpleasant prospect of having to break up the business into chunks where it becomes less optimal for them perhaps to have to maintain more than one center or have different centers for different parts of the business. So there's a lot of lose-lose scenarios of that kind. But I think on those, if you went and spoke to people on the street, apart from the fact that everybody would have an opinion on it, I don't think people quite know what to expect. And so there's a lot of fear of outcomes that, people either believe or have been led to believe, or a lot of irrational hope about outcomes that people have been, again, believe or led to believe. But I don't think on an everyday basis the man on the street is thinking that hard about Brexit. I think everyone's just waiting to see how the cards fall, and then they'll be able to make plans accordingly.
And the on the subject of the, rather than perhaps the sort of average person on the street, but on the subject of the partisans, it's really interesting. You had a quote in another blog post where you noted that Theresa May recently said, "If you're a citizen of the world, then you're a citizen of nowhere." And as someone who's moved around a little bit myself, I find that kind of ominous. As someone who lived in the London of the expats, I find that a little bit ominous. What's your? I mean, and you've obviously lived and traveled and worked in different places, and I was wondering if you could talk. You have a sort of very nuanced response that you give to her quote.
That's true, and again, maybe if I preamble it by saying this is just my view, I of course profoundly disagree with that kind of view, because I think, and maybe to a fault, that I've probably become a part of that globally mobile workforce that actually feels we are in a world beyond countries. I would be happy to have a debate with or a discussion with yourself, for example, over a coffee about how we no longer, have we come to a point where countries are themselves kind of anachronisms? Do we really need countries? And yet so much of our lives are governed, all our laws, all our regulatory environments are governed by countries, whereas most of our business and our social and our economic lives are sort of extra national in a way that we don't even think about it when we pick up the phone and talk to someone, or we do business with someone, or we visit a website and order something off a company. Where the company is and where the headquarters is and where they might be paying tax is the last thing you're thinking of at that point of time. So in a way, we've gone way beyond countries, and we are being pulled back in this kind of environment into a world where we're saying, no, actually countries really matter. And sort of for me personally, is the hope that this is a last gasp of nationalism before we really flip over to a world where we recognize that countries are really almost fictional notions, as I think Yuval Torre says in his books. They are, after all, countries are basically country borders are fiction that we have all agreed to believe in.
You have a really interesting way into this, which is through sport, which is something that I gather you're rather passionate about. And you had a couple of really interesting examples on your blog that I hadn't heard of before, where an athlete can actually be eligible to play for multiple national teams at the same time. And this can happen for various reasons. There's one example of a footballer from Eastern Europe, who, could simultaneously play for, Kosovo and I don't know,
that's right,
Germany and a number of other countries. And the number and identity of the countries that he could play for was this sort of history of conflict and change in European history. And I just think that's a very interesting way to go into this question about nationalism and nationhood and where it starts to matter, because when you have different nations competing, national teams for example, perhaps competing for the same player, what does that say about the arbitrariness of national interest?
Absolutely true. And I could link this back to what we were talking about earlier as well, from the Indian perspective, because there was a generation before mine, let's say my parents' generation, where if you grew up in Calcutta, the chances that you would, your entire family, your social circle, you would marry someone from Calcutta, that was, almost a given. It was the exception rather than the norm that you would actually marry someone from a different state who spoke a different language or came from a different culture. And of course, there are, dozens, if not hundreds, of different subcultures within India. So, in my generation, it was quite common that you found someone across the country, and me and my wife don't share a common mother tongue. And that's so common in my generation that kind of intermingling has made it a very different place now. And I think if you take that at an international level, I think over the last, I would say, maybe 50 years, the people just moving around a lot more, people settling, the intermingling has gone up. So today, to try and draw lines, even within families, it has become much harder. And so, whether you look at sport, whether you look at, I hopefully not, but if should there be a war, there would be so many people who would be so conflicted because we all belong to more than one country. We own allegiance to more than one country. We grew up in one country, and that never leaves you. And you live in another country, and you have another allegiance there. And maybe some of the other places you've lived in, you sort of carry a little bit of that with you. So in a sense, this is also a question of identity. And I think, our identities are no longer tied strongly to one country in the way that it perhaps was in a previous generation. And in a way that's an identity question is, in a way, fundamental to this and the next generation.
It's really interesting, these issues of nationalism and post-nationalism, and I wanted to reflect a little bit on the when we talk about we, for example, especially someone as yourself who's sort of very much in the digital world, there do seem to be these huge divides in ways that when you're in your own way of living, it can be hard to understand really how different you are from other people. And I had this experience recently where I was in the queue at the post office, and there was a guy opening up a post office box, and the clerk mentioned something about email, and he said, "Oh, I never learned how to use a computer." And this man wasn't very old. He would have been early middle age at the most. And I thought about how, for this person, I mean, I if he's never learned how to use a computer, I doubt he's perhaps even traveled outside the country at all. And his world of support and interaction would all be very immediate and right there, personal, perhaps with a television, bringing in stuff from outside the world. And I wonder what you think about that. People who are kind of behind the digital divide, their networks are all going to be right there and personal and kind of regional, and not, international.
You're, absolutely bang on. I mean, and I think I do see that there is a potential danger in an argument that you and I could construct now, which sort of correlates digital competence and awareness to sort of your worldview. Because you could argue, putting aside the example you just cited, that someone could be incredibly well read, have traveled the world and still not know how to use a computer.
That's true.
But having said that, in a more general sense, I think the argument is valid in that, if you cut back to 100 years, you may find that the average distance people, I think there's some data about this as well, the average distance people may have traveled from the place of their birth was a much smaller distance than people travel today. And that goes back to the point of the opening up of the world. It probably is a nod to, the global mobility and labor flows, some of which is, some of which is forced on people, unfortunately, but a lot of it is optional and voluntary. But it's just an opening up of opportunities, therefore. And that comes from an ability to share news, information, data about these opportunities and to be open about where there might be work or opportunity that I could travel to. And an ability to, and I think it's really important that today we could travel somewhere and still be connected to our families. Because I do remember stories of my grandfather, being sent to London when he was studying, and you leave home on a ship, and it's only 3 months later that people hear about you for the first time. So the ability to stay connected is an important ally for us to be able to travel across the world and still be secure in the knowledge that our loved ones are safe and that our friends and family can be reached. So I think that there is certainly a symbiotic relationship between the digital connected societies that we create and our ability to therefore use that same digital connectedness to be able to be very global. And without it, it would certainly be a lot harder. So I broadly agree with the exception that I provided, that you could actually be outside of the digital sphere and still be fairly well experienced and traveled.
Yeah, thank you for making that point. It was very well said and true. Yeah, it's really interesting what you say there about connectivity, because so often one can see from what I guess I'll call technologically conservative sources, like the New York Times, for example, the representation of we can say digital, or like the internet and computers as forces for increasing isolation, and that comes across to me in the same way as a priest watching the pews empty out, accusing everybody else of increased isolation, because at the same time as people might be abandoning older habits or forms of interaction, they're adopting all kinds of new ones that help get them in touch easily and free. I mean, we're talking across a continent and an ocean right now for free. And then, when this is published, anyone will be able to listen to it and learn about you in a way that people couldn't have, even say 20 years ago, and not nearly as easily or freely. And I was wondering what your thoughts are about that. I mean, do you think that when we're spending times with screens, we're more alone than we used to be?
Again, I'll try and be balanced, but in my heart, I think like you do, that I think fundamentally I disagree with the notion that this technology makes you more isolated. I think you can have a perception of that if you are not, if you look at it from the outside, if you are not using a mobile phone the way perhaps your 15-year-old son or daughter are using it, and you're thinking, well, when I was that age, I used to be out with my friends playing. But I think, as you said, the flip side is that it actually engenders a lot more different kinds of connects, and those are in many ways richer. They are more powerful in many ways. So I absolutely fundamentally believe that it's a change. It's not, I don't think it's worse. It's different. And if you're on one side of the difference, it can come across as not good because you don't perhaps immerse yourself in the other world. And I say that with the little asterisk that says, what, if you're at home and if you're with your family and as I'm often guilty of doing, and I'm sort of, I'm drawn to what's happening on my phone. There are probably limits to that, and you want to be able to strike the balance. But to sort of paint the whole thing as this whole technology and this digital generation is isolated, I think is doing that generation a big disservice. I think they are actually more connected and there's more sophistication in that connection, and that whole culture and that society will have its own norms about what and how and when you talk to people, and how asynchronous conversations might sort of take over a bigger chunk of our lives. So I think it's just a different kind of connect. It's a different kind of conversation. It's a different kind of social structure, and I wouldn't call it isolation.
I guess my last, while we're talking about the big picture, my last big picture question for you would be, you wrote about how things seem unpredictable now, but at the same time, part of something you're interested in is trends in technology and society. And if I were to give you the opportunity to make one big, bold prediction that no one will call you on if it doesn't turn out to be true, what might that prediction be for something big that's going to happen in the rest of 2017?
Okay, so the 2017 is pretty much the near future. I think the thing that will occupy a lot of us is actually how we start to use technology to help governments and regulators. And I think we are on the cusp of this change. And I've heard this word reg tech in a couple of forums, but I think that the idea that governments are struggling to keep up with regulatory and compliance activity because technology is leaping ahead could be turned on its head if the same technologies could be used by governments, by regulators. So I could easily you could imagine artificial intelligence being used to drive better regulatory outcomes. So I think in 2017 we'll see recognition of the need for the use of technology and digital tools for the purpose of creating better laws that human beings are struggling to create.
Well, thanks for that. Yeah, that's a huge. Did you say red tech?
Reg, as in regulation.
Oh, okay.
Reg tech. It has a ring to it, so I could easily see it catching on.
It does.
So I'm sure you'll see reg tech forums and events popping up over the next couple of years.
Yeah, it's interesting. I know this is. I'm sure it's a preoccupation everywhere, but it's definitely a preoccupation that people at some levels of government have here in Canada. I have a friend who works for a think tank in Ottawa, and this is, that is a big part of what he spends time thinking about and trying to educate people within government about, is the power, the potential power for regulating and, just governing society that there is in emerging technologies. On the subject of your book, Doing Digital, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about why you decided to write it.
Two parts to that, actually. The first is that I really, because I come at technology from a non-technical background, for me it's always been very fundamental to be able to explain to myself what technology is, what it does, and if it can't be explained in English and in a logical, constructive way, then it's really hard to get to grips with it. So I've been fortunate that I've worked with some technologists who are incredibly good at explaining in a non-technical or to a layperson the fundamental building blocks of the technology. But that's become a driver for me over the years to be able to understand technology without necessarily knowing how to code. And I recognize that in the digital space, there is this challenge of a lot of new technology, a lot of conceptually tricky aspects. But it's not just technology, it's technology plus design plus methodology. All of this is changing, plus the whole data side of things. And because I guess of my background of being, bouncing around from domain to domain, I found myself actually in a position where I could have a basic understanding of all these domains, and that actually put me at a big advantage, I think, because I wasn't a specialist in any one of these areas, so I was able to step back and look at all of them and sort of play with them in a way that I could bring them together. And I realized that a lot of my colleagues and the people I meet struggle with, because they either a lot of people obviously, as you know, are technophobic and they would rather not engage at all, or a lot of people tend to be very specialized, and then they see the world as through their lens. So if you're if you're a technologist, you see a technology world. If you're a design person, you see the user interface and experience world. If you're a data person, you see a different world. And the reality is actually it's all of these, and you don't want to lock yourself into any one narrow siloed view of the digital space. So for me, these two are the motivations of A, being able to explain it in a layperson, and B, being able to pull together these different facets into some kind of cohesive whole, so you can take one step back and say, okay, I get what the whole thing looks like.
Yeah, it's really interesting. You talk a little bit in the beginning of your book about how difficult it can sometimes be to explain to people what a person like you does. But and it's partly because you see things as this intersection of all these different things, whereas people often have a sort of they get ensconced in their specialization and don't see the connections. And you have this very great definition of what digital means, and I'm just going to say it here. It means exploiting emerging technologies to create customer or user-centric experiences and data-driven decisions, leading to more agile, competitive, and responsive business models. End quote. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the Connect, Quantify, and Optimize execution framework that you talk about, because it seems to me that in a very practical way, it shows how all these things connect when you're, designing a business, as it were.
Sure. I think the definition that you just read out is more the conceptual framework, as I said. So it's important to understand that it's like a recipe book. You need something from the emerging technology box, and that might be robotics or artificial intelligence or even mobile technologies. Something that sits in there. You need something that sits in the data box, because that technology is going to give you some interesting new data, and you need something from the design box, because in the digital world, I think a fundamental premise is people have options. All your users have options. And so if you don't give them something that is well designed and solves their problem, they simply won't use it. Even if you are a CIO and that's the system you've rolled out, people will just go to whatever system they prefer. So you do need these three to be used in the right recipe to get to a digital outcome. But that, when you look at that conceptually, that makes sense. But when you try to execute it, what's the sequence? How do you go about it? And that's where I sort of thought about the Connect, Quantify, Optimize model. And all that says is, everyone you talk about in digital will point to the power of data. But the reality is you don't get the data up front. You don't just walk in and people don't give you the data. So you take a step back, and actually the first step is the connect, which means if you've designed something really well, if you solved a problem for a customer or a user, then you've built that connect layer, which means, to give you a very trivial example and an oft repeated one, if you're looking at a service like Uber, the fact that I, as a taxi driver, and you as a customer, we can find each other, that's just the value of connect. And there is value in just the connect itself, because now I don't have to walk out on the street and wait. I can just find you on my phone. You can find me, and we can get to each other and transact. And you can see this in a number of different scenarios. But just once you've connected is when there is the automatic exchange of data, the release of data. So now because you've designed this part well, I'm happy to share with you my information, my data, and you start to see as a user what kind of rides I take, or as a driver, what kind of services I deliver, and that data then allows you the next level of value, which is the quantification. So now you can see that in London there is there is X amount of demand, or there is Y amount of supply, and that allows you to plan your business. It allows you to price your business and do all the clever stuff that you can do if you had all the numbers, for example, for any business. So the quantification comes out of the power of the connect. But then you get to the third part, which I think is the bit that very few businesses actually have gotten to with digital. I would say about 5% at the top of my off the top of my head, which is the optimized part. And I take Uber as an example because it nicely translates. Because what Uber does with surge pricing, whether you like it or not, and as users we all hate surge pricing, but what surge pricing does is it allows Uber, based out of the data that they collect, to tweak the economic model in a very local manner. So they can say that for this region, that may be a half a square mile, and for a 20-minute period, they can change the pricing model. And you can only do that if you have that level of granular data. And so that, I think, is the cycle of being able to actually optimize your business, not at a very generic global level, but in a very micro way. That's where the optimization comes in digital. And so ideally, all businesses should be able to work through the connect and quantify model, and then with the data they get, and that data might be very different for different businesses, but you will then get the answers and the nuggets of insight that you need that will allow you to then optimize your business model. And that optimization could be an economic optimization like Uber, it could be a service optimization, it could be something competitive, but that cycle then sets itself up, and the more you optimize and the more you quantify, the better you can then connect, and that sets up a virtuous cycle. Hopefully that then takes your business forward faster.
Yeah, one example that I don't know if it's in I forget if it's in your book or in your blog that you talk about with respect to optimization is Amazon applying for a patent for anticipatory delivery, which is the idea that Amazon, because it knows what books you buy. I was talking with someone about this just the other day. Amazon's opening up for a while now some physical bookstores that they're experimenting with, and one thing one can imagine Amazon is doing is watching what books people from a certain area are buying on Amazon on the website, and then perhaps stocking the local bookshop with those books, anticipating or having seen the demand. But anticipatory delivery, I'll let you talk about it, but this is a really interesting concept.
Absolutely. From the way I understood it, what Amazon is also doing is it's setting up warehouses across the world where, based on its understanding not just of books but pretty much everything you order off the Amazon website, and we know that their repertoire is just growing, they will start shipping stuff somewhere close to you in anticipation of it's being ordered. And if you sort of join it up with some of the other things that they're trying, which is drone-based delivery, and they will own their own entire supply chain, there is a likelihood that you may run out of something very trivial like tea in your kitchen, and you may actually go to Amazon and order it, and it may get delivered to your doorstep within half an hour by an Amazon drone, because their models have anticipated that X amount of sugar will be ordered in this area, and the warehouse ready with that kind of stock. So I think it takes mind shift change for us to stop, and I know that lots of people will feel this is an intrusion, or they'll feel that it's a bit creepy, but I think you have to stop thinking about it like that, because this is no different from what any business has always done. It's just a slightly fine-tuned version of the way a Walmart or a Tesco might have stocked their local stores. But it's just that if they had better information and better insights and better prediction, they would have done the same thing. But I think the idea is very powerful because of the granularity of that data that Amazon gets from each individual customer.
It's really interesting what you say about how, in some ways, this is no different from what businesses have always done. And one of the themes of our conversation has been, privacy and identification and data and things like that. And, there's this curious contradiction one sees where at the same time where someone might be very bothered by, a company using computers to gather data on them and then serve up advertisements. For example, you based on search terms that you've been using, you suddenly start seeing ads around things like that on other websites when you're on the internet. But at the same time, people will say, but you know what, that same person even might say, I miss that personal connection that I had with my local shopkeep, who they would have no problem divulging,
yes.
all of their
Absolutely.
personal, and not only their own, but gossip about other people and
Yes.
their private
Yes.
lives. And I just wanted to ask, I know this is probably a bit of an odd question, but what is it about the intervention of the computer that somehow suddenly makes people concerned? And I'm not just talking about how, like scale and things like that. Like there really does seem to be something about this device that people find uncanny.
That's really interesting, actually. And I don't think I've heard the question phrased that way, but it does lead me to, privacy has many of these, interesting little ironies. One of them being, a few years back, we all know this. We used to print telephone directories, and we would put everybody's name and phone number and address
right.
into a giant book, and then we distribute it to everybody so that everybody knew everybody else's, what we consider today to be very private details. And we were all okay with it. It didn't matter that we were being given each other's phone numbers and addresses. And yet we are now super concerned about that same information, being shared with anybody else. So it's an interesting flip-flop. I think that the things that have perhaps suddenly moved the needle for a lot of people is how permanent this is, and that the sense that I think it's just the awareness that this information could easily be used by anybody, and that anybody includes people who may have less than the best interests at their heart in terms of what they want to do with their information. And it was always there, by the way. Obviously, people could have used the telephone directory to stalk people or find out things about people and use it maliciously. But somehow, I think the absolute ubiquity of the way this information on the internet spreads, and the fact that we can be found from far corners of the world by people who are not like us, so to say. So we go back to the whole, people like us, nationalism, or in some way localism argument. But I think all of those unknowns and those the fear of who it might be that's looking at our data, I think is a part of the concern people have right now. But I'll also say, let me give you a very different thought experiment, which is, we've always, and I ask this of people who are more devout than I am, we always think of God as omniscient. And do we worry about privacy? Because, a super being like a God knows and sees everything. And at what point of time do we start worrying about, people that we, or beings that we consider as super beings like gods, having access to our private data, and why does that not worry us? So, you can take this in a number of different interesting ways. I think actually the reality is that in many ways privacy is history, because we've given away too much of it. So I recognize that people may have valid concerns, but the reality is, we leave trails everywhere we go. If you use a credit card, if you use any kind of urban travel card like an Oyster, we are leaving these trails of information across pretty much everything we do. And I think that genie is way, way, way out of the bottle, and there's no way you can put it back. Now, I think going forward, we certainly need to come up with better governance and fair use of the data. And I think there is something to be said about rewarding the individual for the economic value of their data. And I think all of those, I'm sure, will evolve. But I think privacy is pretty much gone. You have to work very hard to be private in today's world.
I guess my last question about this is related to that, both super beings and privacy, I come at it from the direction of voice activated interfaces or voice based interfaces, and so the reason this is a privacy issue is because there's a sense in which your Amazon Echo might be listening to you, or your Samsung television might be listening to you all the time, anticipating a trigger word. Like, what is it? Hello Google or OK Google, or
Right.
Using the name Alexa. And I was wondering, in the context of the Internet of Things, just generally, what are your thoughts about, where this technology might be heading in the future? Am I going to be able to talk to my range and say, set to 350 degrees, bake for 45 minutes?
Putting aside the privacy angle for a bit, I think voice is fundamentally important as an option for the interface. And I think this struck me when I first started using Alexa, because you can certainly envisage a scenario where a certain category of people, i.e., people who are elderly, who struggle with a screen, who have for whatever reason failing eyesight, to have the option of being able to do the same things with voice is actually quite a powerful one. So I could certainly see voice becoming a really important part of the mix. And yes, then you can apply to pretty much anything. You can set your fridge controls, your range, or indeed, open your front door if you know the person who's knocking. So just think of voice as an alternative interface, and I think it makes a lot of sense to have in the mix for any number of reasons. Now, whether that translates to a device listening to you, I think goes back to the point of, do we have a set of guidelines and transparency about the governance of that? Because just because you talk to Google and you say, okay, Google, and you're suddenly concerned about whether it's listening to you, but, if an organization, not necessarily Google or any of the big ones, if an organization decided to put a listening device into something innocuous, would you know? It just so happens that now we're aware of that device listening. So if someone had the wrong intent, the harm could be done anyway. So this being much more out there and open probably has a much better chance of being governed and the data being managed well, because now it's all above board. It's obvious that there is some listening happening, and so those companies, be it Amazon or Google or Apple, are clearly expected to provide enough evidence of the fact that they're not listening and storing everything that you're saying. So I think it's that whole premise of, when something is, when you legalize something, it's much easier to govern. In the same way that if voice is an accepted part of our interface, we will have better rules around it. But if someone had a listening device, let's say in a photo frame that I bought from a brand, I wouldn't even know about it. So the technology already exists to do that. So it's better that it's in a space where it can be better governed and there are rules around it.
Oh, thanks for that really good answer. I hadn't quite thought of things from that perspective before. But yeah, certainly being open and upfront about things can help us manage transitions to new technologies.
It just makes the risks very explicit, I guess. So that's it's easier to deal with.
Yeah. Moving on to the last part of the interview, I wanted to ask you why you chose Leanpub as a platform for your book.
So this goes back to my my delight at discovering Leanpub, because while writing this book and obviously working through subjects like Agile and the whole idea of MVPs, the thought struck me that it would be amazing to write a book as an MVP, and why don't people write a book as an MVP and then come back and do version 2 and version 3, because that would be so much, it would be so cool to read a book and then come back and read version 2 and version 3 and to be able to see the evolution of that thinking, perhaps based on the debates that you've had around version 1. And so, I had that at the back of my mind when I started writing the book, and I obviously didn't do much about it. And then I think while looking at the publishing options, and I'll confess that I don't remember exactly how I came across the Leanpub site. Maybe it was through a search, maybe it was through an article, maybe I was reading on other sites about publishing options. But the Leanpub model fit exactly what was in my head about the idea of being able to publish in an agile way. So I was instantly sold. And until that point, I was in this debate in my head about whether to try a traditional publishing route and talk to publishers or to do a self-publishing model. But the Leanpub, once I came across Leanpub, that debate was pretty much over in my head because it was such an easy way to publish, and it was exactly what I wanted to.
Great, and it's always. I mean, it's as excited as it sounds like you were to find us. We're always excited to see authors like you from our end as well, which is just great. And it's I wanted to ask about something specific that you've done, which is something that a lot of Leanpub authors do, which is that you've actually published an email address in the introduction, or I think it's in the introduction to your book, and invited feedback. Have you had any experience with readers giving you feedback yet?
Just a little bit. It's very early days, and I'm, to be honest, I've probably not understood this well enough, and I'm still working on it. I think I'm still working on formatting it better, because the last time I uploaded something, there was a slight formatting issue. So I haven't gone all out with, the publicity, because I'm just trying to work through that cycle. And as soon as I do that, I will make a much bigger push, and then I suspect the volume of feedback will also go up. But I have had some feedback, and again, I think I make that point in my book that a book like this should be a dialogue. It is. None of the points I make are cast in stone, and each of them is an opinion that can be challenged. And I think that's a fabulous process. That goes back to everything we've been talking about, that we're in a world where we can have this kind of dialogue between an author and a reader. So I absolutely look forward to, a ton of opinion and comment that, will push me to think differently, think better, think harder about some of the things I'm saying, and perhaps come back to a version 2, which is stronger and better than version 1.
That's a really exciting way to describe the process. I've never heard anyone put it quite that way before, but that dynamic and interaction is something that we definitely are happy to see authors like yourself exploring with joy. Well, I guess we've been going on for quite some time, and it's been a really fascinating discussion. And I wanted to thank you for being on the Leanpub podcast and for being a Leanpub author.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Some of the topics we talked about, obviously around the bigger impact of technology in society, have been buzzing around in my head. So maybe someday we'll be talking about a book that looks at some of the bigger issues, and we can have this discussion all over again.
Well, I look forward to that day. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Len. It's been a pleasure.